Okay. Well, good. I think we have a nice, robust group, and I'm so excited for this afternoon's conversation. Um, my name is Brian Farkas. I'm a litigation partner at a law firm called Arent Fox in New York City, and I am joined by just an incredible group of panelists who are like the all-star dream team of who you would dream up if you wanted to organize a discussion around this topic. So we'll get to them in a minute. We're just so excited for this discussion. Um, when I was in law school, I always felt like I was behind. I felt like I was behind I went straight from college. I was what they call K through JD. I always felt like there was something I didn't know. I didn't know when to apply for law review. I didn't know when to apply for student clubs. I didn't know when to outline, when to study. I always had this like sinking feeling that other people were like one step ahead of me. And it took me a while to get over that feeling, maybe more years than it probably should have. But what I have seen and what I think all of us have seen over the past 3, 4, 5 years, really especially since the COVID-19 pandemic, is that feeling of everyone feeling a little bit behind and everyone feeling a little bit nervous has been accentuated even more than when I was in school and when many of us were in school. A feeling that is so common among law students. That feeling has been just accelerated through what we have labeled as the OCI crisis or the OCI revolution for the purposes of this conversation. I think everyone who has registered for this program already has a pretty good sense of what we're talking about. But just to really tee up the issue before we delve into it, the issue has a lot of different components. There are legal components, antitrust components, structural components, but primarily it's a timeline issue. We have a situation where the timeline of recruitment for law students has just been dramatically accelerated. And that has created effects on everyone from poor, innocent little 1Ls who are just trying to learn Paul's graph and the basics of IRAC, all the way up through deans of career services and employers around the country who are trying to wrestle with these deadlines and what those deadlines mean for their campuses and for their students. So today we have just an incredible conversation, as I said, with five just thought leaders and leaders generally on these issues. And without further ado, just going to briefly introduce, we have Carey Bertolet Grand, who's the Dean of Career Services at Cardozo, someone I've worked with personally and is just a phenomenal mentor and educator and thought leader in this space. We have Bruce Elvin, who's the Associate Dean and also a Senior Lecturing Fellow in the Career and Professional Development Center at Duke Law School, just to show that we're not totally New York focused. We have a national presence here. Although I know Bruce has plenty of New York experience as well, and plenty of national experience, which we'll be leaning on. Lillian Evans, the ultimate New Yorker, ran recruiting for the New York City Law Department, which is also called the Corporation Council here in New York City, which is a public service entity that, of course, does tremendous amount of law student recruiting and recently moved to the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Southern District of New York, where she has the same function of recruitment of new talent for the U.S. Attorney's Office. So she will be talking to us about the public interest element of these issues in addition to the private sector. Nikaya Gray. We are so lucky to have Nikaya, who's the executive director of the National Association of Law Placement, commonly called NALP. Nikaya knows more statistics. She's forgotten more statistics in the last day than the rest of us probably will learn in a lifetime. But Nikaya is going to give us just an overview of the law recruitment universe in a way that really, I think, requires a national perspective on these issues. So we're very excited for the NALP input in addition to the national kind of statistics, also what NALP has done and what NALP is working on right now in connection with these issues. And then finally, last but not least, we have Nancy Parker, who is the Director of Attorney Recruitment at Fried Frank in New York City. If you don't know Nancy Parker, she's kind of like the Kevin Bacon of the New York legal industry, where everyone is kind of like 1 or 2 degrees of separation from her. I have had the pleasure of being recruited or almost recruited by Nancy, and she's like really compelling. I would work with her pretty much anywhere. So we are really lucky to have Nancy, who I have many friends who have been summer associates at Fried Frank, and I know from firsthand experience, it's really one of the best organized and most thoughtfully constructed summer programs in Big Law. Don't tell the people upstairs that I just said that, but hopefully this isn't being recorded. Oh, wait, it is. But we're so lucky to have Nancy here to give us the Big Law perspective from the place of the recruiter, which I think is another stress point here. The folks who work in law firms who are doing that recruitment work. So with that, I want to now that we've kind of kicked it off and have some intro, I'd like to turn this over to Nikaya to give us just the beginnings of an introduction to this issue, how it has evolved, how it has changed, and Nikaya will then be supplemented by Bruce, who also knows just a tremendous amount from the law school perspective. So Nikaya, tell us what's happening. Tell us what's been happening.
Yeah, absolutely, Brian. So, and just to give you a big picture overview to really understand how we got to where we are today in terms of the timing of OCI and recruiting, you have to understand a bit about the history of OCI, as well as a bit about antitrust regulation. So starting with OCI, once a long time ago, before most of us here in this room were practicing, fall OCI actually used to happen in the fall, right? It used to happen in either September or October of a student's 2L year. But over time, some schools started to inch their OCI programs earlier. And it actually started with the New York schools who moved to August 1st because they had space constraints that made it really difficult for them to have OCI at the same time that they were having classes. But in doing so, right, their students got an advantage because they were being interviewed by the employers first. And so one by one, other schools started to inch up their OCIs as well, out of the sense that they had to in order to make sure that their students could compete with the New York school students. And by the early 2000s, the majority of schools had settled into having OCI in August. Now, some were a little bit earlier in that last week of July. We had some holdouts that stayed in the fall. Harvard was a notable holdout that kept their OCI in the fall all the way up until the Great Recession. But by and large, most of the schools settled into having OCI in August, right? And it stays that way up until the pandemic hit. Additionally, throughout this entire time, OCI was the main vehicle for law firms to recruit students. By and large, firms had to go through the schools if they wanted access to enough students to fill all their slots for their summer program, right? Which is a really important detail here that I'll come back to in a minute. So that's how things were up until the pandemic hits. So now we're in summer 2020, right? And as you'll recall, the world was in absolute chaos, right? There was uncertainty about everything. The vaccines weren't out yet. We weren't traveling. We weren't meeting in person. Businesses were virtual. Schools were virtual, right? And all the law schools canceled their OCI programs that summer, right? Eventually, most of the schools ended up holding some sort of program that was virtual in January of 2021. But in the beginning, it was not clear that that was going to happen. There wasn't the technology out yet to even allow us to coordinate those large-scale interview programs like that. So there's all this uncertainty that year as to how recruiting might happen. And while the schools were trying to figure this all out, students started to engage the firms, right? And so students and firms began engaging each other directly on a much wider basis than what we were seeing previously. And that explodes the following year, right? So now we're in 2021. We're still in the pandemic, but now we've all become good and adept at living in this virtual world. And the technology has developed that made it easy to do so, to connect with each other virtually. In terms of recruiting, OCI moved back to August in that year, but remained virtual. But students and firms were now in this modality of direct engagement, and they continue to do so. So in 2021, we saw that 56% of students were reporting that they reached out to employers directly, so not through their school's OCI programs. which was a much larger percentage than what we had seen previously. And over 70% of those students were reporting that they were successful in obtaining a screening interview by their direct outreach, right? So what had been this very analog recruiting process that was driven by the schools was now suddenly digital and being driven by multiple parties, right? And that, of course, spurred a lot of things. It had a lot of benefits for firms. One of the criticisms that firms have always had with OCI is that many use a lottery system, which some of the firms don't like, right? Firms also got to control the timing of the process, which had multiple benefits for them. There has long been lamenting in the NALP circles that August was a terrible time to hold OCI. In fact, NALP's prior executive director wrote this article called "August is the Cruelest Month," right? Because it was so hard to have OCI in August, because that's when all the attorneys took vacation, right? And so it was really hard to get a critical mass of attorneys to go out to all these different schools within a short window to interview all these students, right? But also, of course, it opened the possibility up of interviewing candidates before their competitors did. On top of all of this, it was suddenly very easy for firms and students to connect, irrespective of where they were in the world, and to do it without the schools being involved. The pandemic, if you recall, forced the widespread adoption of technology like Zoom that allowed us to connect very easily, that wasn't being widely used before. It also forced us to become comfortable with the concept of interviewing and hiring candidates we never met in person, which was completely unheard of prior to the pandemic. So firms could interview students and hire them anywhere in the country at any time with very little effort, and they didn't need to go through the schools anymore to do it. So as the world starts to come out of the pandemic, not every firm wanted to go back to the way things were. Some firms were very vocal that they preferred to recruit students directly. They saw it as a superior process and viewed OCI as a secondary method to either top up or round out their summer programs. And of course, that then has the snowball effect on the market that we're seeing today, as firms try to outdo each other to be the first to reach those students. By 2023, we saw that only a slight majority of offers were still being made through OCI. It was 52% that year. And 45% of the offers were being made in July or earlier. Now, we're in the process of collecting the data right now for the 2024 cycle, but I expect that we're going to see that the majority of offers were made during the 24 cycle outside of OCI and before July. So with all this shifting, so that's how we got to where we are today. And with all this shifting, there's been a host of issues, which my fellow panelists here are going to discuss, and they are very, very real issues. And I think there's a collective sense out there that we ought to be able to do things better, right? And the single most common question I'm getting right now is, can't NALP stop this? And the honest answer to that question is no, we cannot. And neither can the schools, and neither can the firms. And to understand why we can't, you have to understand just a little bit about antitrust regulation. So to make sure we're all on the same page here as we go forward with the rest of our discussion, the basic premise behind US antitrust law is simply the belief that the market benefits from robust competition. That term trust and antitrust actually comes from a term used in the 19th century to refer to a group of businesses that teamed up in some manner to manipulate the market. It was like Standard Oil and stuff at that time. And on a fundamental level, what antitrust law does is prevents trust. It prevents businesses from joining together to limit how they're going to act in the market in order to avoid competing with each other, right? And so we say that, strictly speaking, competitors are expected to compete. So the short of it is that what we're seeing right now in recruiting is a product of the market, right? We have competing businesses, the firms, who are jockeying for a position in a tight market with each other. And what we're seeing is the result of that. The market could certainly move in a different direction. And I think over time it will. But practically and legally, we cannot lead the market to a different place by agreeing to limit our competitive behavior, right? So that's how we got to where we are, and the broad boundaries of what we can do to address what we're seeing in the market.
Terrific. Thank you for that. When we were doing a prep session, Nakaya was like, I'm going to be what did you call yourself? Dr. No or something? Like, no, we can't do that. We'll get later on in this session to some brainstorming around what firms, employers, schools might be able to do in light of what was just said. But for now, just starting with an overview. Bruce, anything you'd like to add to that?
I agree basically with everything you said, so nicely done, Nakaya. The only thing I'll add is first, recruiting was basically similar since the 1960s through 2019. As I learned on the NALP website, New York City Bar Association, in fact, had guidelines similar to those that became the NALP ones in the 60s. So basically, anybody who has gone to law school, worked in a law school, worked in a law firm, or recruiting, or is a lawyer since the 1960s until like 2020 had basically the same experience. And the two guidelines that were the most meaningful, and those persisted until 2019-20, really was there's always a date when 1Ls wouldn't be doing recruiting things sometime in the fall, and then there was a date when offers for 2Ls could stay open. Those things shifted in the new millennium, as Nikaya talked about, but they were still there, and the versions of those is what had been there since the 60s. So that's why those who aren't involved in it and feel this change, it is dramatic, because it's been the water that every law school and lawyer has lived in for their life. So that's the only thing I will add to Nikaya's great overview.
Terrific. I think that's right on point. So I'd like to turn now to first consider the effects on students, and then we're going to turn to consider the effects on employers. But we have here two student-focused deans, Carey and Bruce. So Carey, maybe you could start with, from your vantage point, from your seat, how are students being affected by the changes that Bruce and Nikaya just sort of described at a macro level? What's the impact on like that average 1L, that average 2L on your campus?
Absolutely. And that overview, Nikaya, is great because I want to get super granular and sort of talk about, if you are a current 2L, what your experience was last year. And I think Cardozo is fairly typical of, Nikaya, exactly what you were saying. 2 years ago, most of our big law placement happened through OCI, although it was an increasingly smaller percentage. And this past summer, most happened outside of OCI. So we have made that switch into, for sure, this accelerated recruiting model. So for our current 2L students, folks that went through this last summer, it started off, I would say, fairly typical. We start advising our students in earnest in January around Big Law and what it means to work at Big Law. And the spring has receptions and programming and a lot of law firm driven things. We do a really wonderful employer forum to meet law firms. So that was pretty typical. But then there starts to be this like hive mind, right? Where everybody sort of knows what's coming. And Reddit, which I am not a subscriber, but I hear a lot about Reddit. Everybody starts saying the firms are going to fill up, there are going to be no jobs. And there's this like scarcity mentality all of a sudden, right? So there's panic with the students. Students are afraid that if a firm opens their application portal, they're immediately going to fill their summer class. So there starts to be this like stress and this pressure, and a pressure to network and to spend more time being firm facing, right? Sort of doing the receptions, being out there, networking, all that kind of thing. So then we hit May. For our students, again, every school has a slightly different calendar, but ours I think is fairly typical. They've got finals, which are super important. They immediately go into the writing competition, and then they pretty much immediately go into their 1L summer job. And I'm going to let Lily talk a little bit more about that. But for most of our students, they were maybe like 1 week into their summer jobs when they really needed to get their applications in to be competitive on this accelerated recruiting cycle. So they're maybe just getting grades in, they've maybe just gotten grades in, they're working their summer job, they haven't had a break, they haven't had a nap, they haven't gone to a family wedding, they are just right into having to answer these questions for themselves. Am I even interested in Big Law? They've got to kind of make that decision at that point. That's the window where you've got to do it. Which of these hundreds of firms are even interesting to me? What practice areas am I interested in? What even are some of these practice areas? Have I written compelling and effective cover letters? Is my writing sample polished? And maybe most importantly, am I competitive for these positions? Right. And so that's kind of the thing that we saw for the first time this past cycle that I think was really concerning for us, which is you sort of have this law school O. Henry story, which is a student who really wants Big Law, goes out and starts networking and focusing on meeting folks from big law, and maybe they trade their study time and their academic pursuits to go out and interact with big law firms. If their grades suffer, then they're not as competitive for these firms, right? And when it comes time to apply, it's harder or maybe even impossible to land this job. So we saw some of that, and that's heartbreaking, right? And we talk a lot as a profession about mental health of students. We talk about diversity, we talk about equity, we talk about the inclusion of students who maybe are first generation or who have had challenge in accessing law school. And I truly, truly, truly believe that I know everybody on this panel cares about those things. I truly believe law schools do. I truly believe law firms care about those things. But I think our process is failing our students on that point, right? Mental health, having time to prepare. And just a quick data point, the Northeast Black Law Student Association, which is a student-run nonprofit, has a big career fair in August every year. That's a big Northeast thing. Historically, 40, 50 big national law firms participate. It's been a great career fair for our students historically. And starting in 2023, the number of big law firms who participate in that fair diminished by about half. And thanks to my friends at New York Law School who helped me get some data this past year, about 4 of the big national firms showing up. And for me, that's, we need to pause. And Brian, I appreciate so much you getting this panel and this discussion going. We need to pause and make sure that we're doing right by our students.
That's so helpful to get so granular like that. Bruce, what's your perspective on this issue?
Carey did a masterful job of summarizing, talking about exactly the issues that my colleagues and I talk about extensively, that I talk about with people at other schools. It's pretty much universal. I could add nothing, but I won't do that because, I have the floor, but you did a great job, and I agree 100%. I guess, I'll try to distill it to the headlines, since we had the similar experiences, right? So we've surveyed our students extensively, again, talk with other schools to get some of the results of their surveys and 2L comments. So putting it all together, a couple of the headlines are, students report a compromised academics and mental health by adding school year recruiting to the rigor of law school. I think that's one of the things you said. Another point, making informed decisions was challenging due to the hiring timelines over the summer, and that the timelines were also conflicting, which added more stress to that factor. And one other point on this topic that, again, Lily will go into, is that the disparate recruiting timelines prevented full engagement on the 1L summer job, and that students' professional development and practical skills were not as developed as much as they had anticipated. And this is students recognizing this. So all these things are the results of student observations. Again, we have some quotes I was gathering. Maybe that helps as well. I was torn between applying for jobs and focusing on studying for exams in the spring semester. It's almost impossible to balance everything at once, especially once the job search is added in. How messy and unstructured and stressful and awful this whole process was, particularly negatively impacting first-gen students and many others. So there's a lot of things we could go into, but Carey summarized it well. And I guess I'll just finish on this at the moment. Students they have no way to evaluate, to weigh the networking or the studying. Like most of us, when we make decisions on our job, we can assign weights to the various factors, but they don't know how much this extra interview, this extra networking call is worth versus, studying for torts for a half hour longer. And I think that's a huge cause of it too. Anyway, yeah, Carey did a great job.
So I have a couple follow-up questions for both of you. So Bruce, maybe a first follow-up question for you, and Carey, feel free to chime in as well. From your perspectives, sorry, sorry about that I lost my voice. I'm so sorry. I lost my voice last week, so I sound like Kermit the Frog. Um, could you comment on sort of the advising perspective of like you guys in your offices? You have, hundreds of students who now are coming to you and saying, what's Paul Weiss? What's a Cravath? What's Aaron Fox? What's Fox Rothschild? I would think that that creates just tremendous pressure on your counselors to have to just, these hundreds of students have just started and now they're asking, I assume, some pretty granular questions.
Yeah,
What's that like in terms of your staffing and in terms of kind of just the blocking and tackling of what your offices have to do?
that's a very timely question. I mean, the last month, even as Carey said this, even 2 weeks in. So at our school, every student 1L gets assigned a career counselor, have to meet at least 3 times. The first meetings are sort of mid-September through October. And most, like 3/4 of the students, the number one topic was, how much networking and cold emailing do I have to be doing now? And I feel behind already. I need to be studying and all this. And so our number one piece of advice was focus on academics. Go to some events, and we also didn't have firms on campus until October 1 this year, which helped a bit. I think helped a lot, give students some space. But then, now it's October, it's like, sure, go to events, but you don't have to send out 10 cold emails right now. Focus on classes. That's got to be it. And yeah, start with that. And so that's the number one message now, certainly through the semester. Go to some things, have some conversations, learn a bit, but focus on academics.
Yeah, Brian, it feels strange sometimes to be a career advisor and be telling students to not worry about the job search right now. It's a very strange feeling, and I got an email from a student last week, I would say semi-panicky, saying, hey, I hear a bunch of firms are going to start looking at applications this semester before we get grades, and should I be applying to these firms now, and are they really going to do this? And I got on the phone and said, where are you seeing this? And of course, this was like a post on Reddit. So it's, I think to your question, the advising is like, we can absolutely handle the advising. It's not a staffing issue. We are happy to do it. I think the problem is sometimes we feel like we're shouting into the wind, and you have a conversation with somebody and say, like, really, you can focus on being a student. You can take time for your fundamentals and really focus there. And then they leave my office and they're getting a lot of different noise. And I think that's where the challenge is.
And I can imagine there's something unsatisfying about a student who's worried about career who comes to you guys and you say, go study for torts, it'll be fine. And I'm sure that inside they don't necessarily hear that completely. One more follow-up question for both of you. I'm wondering, how does this accelerated timeline impact different student populations? So we can slice and dice that in a number of ways. Someone alluded earlier to first gen. I'm also wondering part-time versus full-time, LLMs versus JDs. We can also think of it in terms of sort of US news, like does this impact Duke in the T14? Is that impacted differently than a school that's maybe unranked or below 100 or something along those lines? Or is this sort of impacting everyone kind of across the board? So either of you want to take any elements of that question?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is from talking to my colleagues at other schools, I think this is a fairly universal experience that we are having. I think where you can kind of slice it and dice it a little bit is that the difference between having an on-campus or sort of a law school run recruitment program and opening a portal is that if a firm opens a career portal, which, you know, feels like a fairly sort of positive, good, neutral thing to do, here's our 1L summer job internship, for example, then you've got the thousands, tens of thousands of law students who can see that. And if you are doing it on November 1st, for example, those students don't have their GPA yet. They don't really have, to Bruce's point, they don't know how academics and the networking and all of that stuff balances out. So I was talking to a colleague of mine who's at a law firm who said last year she opened a 1L internship for one position nationally and immediately got like 1,000 applications. So I think one of the concerns is that it is, you know, the recruitment is to everybody. And sort of when you put that on the internet, you've now inspired action and taking, you know, now you've got thousands of law students stopping what they are doing to apply to those. And I think that's the demographic then gets so big, the audience for these positions gets so big that it can be, it's really inequitable, I think, how many people are applying now for sort of how many positions without having yet sort of had the time to get the education about what this market looks like.
Yeah, and one of the, I guess, goals or attributes or results of first year of law school historically was, right, everybody does the same courses and has the same, you know, the same professional development opportunities at their school as everybody else. So by the end of 1L year, I mean, yes, people came in differently situated, but they've all had a year of the same experiences to hopefully feel more, you know, that they're all ready to grab the opportunities. And they definitely, you know, now they probably don't feel that way. So, and they're probably right that some people are more prepared than others.
So we've just heard quite a lot about the challenges facing both student populations as well as the folks who have to advise them, often very early on. Let's shift our conversation now to the employer perspective on this issue. So we're going to turn to Nancy and Lillian, who are two expert recruiters, one representing, of course, the sort of traditional big law recruitment, and the other representing public sector recruitment, which is, of course, another aspect of what used to be early on campus interviews that's affected by all of this. So Nancy, maybe we could start with you. From your perspective, your vantage point in the profession, how have these changes impacted your work and the work of the folks who work with you to recruit the best and brightest law students around the country?
Thank you so much. And I fully recognize that on this panel, I have both, you know, heavy is the crown, so to speak, of representing big law here. You know, I think there were some,
right? We can just blame
yes,
you. Perfect.
entirely. Send all Q&As and chats to my direction. I think there were some positives. There are some positives in the sense of it gave us access to students, and it gave us access to students quickly. And you were able to start to build relationships with folks and hopefully create some stickiness with people. And it allowed an opportunity for people to feel that you were targeting a population of students who were really interested in you. And I sort of say that loosely based on what we have just heard from Carey and Bruce, that, you know, reflecting back on things, how genuine was the interest? And was it truly brought on by panic? I had shared a little bit with this panel before getting on that I had a coffee with a 1L student last week, and it was very eye-opening to see how emotional the student was, that she thought she was already really, really behind in landing a job, not only for her 1L summer, but for her 2L summer. And the negatives here are that it feels like a real race. It feels like a race to grab the talent. I think from a firm's perspective, you feel like you're just not doing enough. You feel like you are not present enough on campus. I know that I've been sort of going around to the different schools and saying, how do I get in front of your students? And the Bruces and Careys of the world are like, please don't. Let them have some time to learn about why they're even in law school, get their sea legs under them. What we saw in the process was a ton of applications, maybe from students who really shouldn't have been applying at that time when the portal opened. They weren't ready to tell their story. They truly needed a second semester to figure things out and to be able to genuinely say the practice areas that they were interested in, or why my firm or any other firm had something to offer them, and that they could bring something to the table. A colleague of mine who I think is watching today, and our diversity and inclusion team, had said to me, what about the folks who don't have that navigational capital? And I wrote that down because it really stuck with me that, you had to sort of know what you should know. And I have no doubt that Bruce and Carey can say that there are a large number of really well qualified students who didn't fare well in this process, because the train just came through, and it came through quickly. On the recruiting teams, it was a tremendous impact, and not a great one, in the sense of having to administer this recruiting process while administering the summer associate program. And recruiting teams take great pride in knowing their summer associates and being experience makers. And I'm sure I'm not alone in feeling like your summer associates arrived and you were like, Godspeed. I hope you can sort of navigate yourself around the firm, because I'm on to the next. And that is so not who I am, and so not who any recruiter is, because you're in this business for the love of people. And it felt very much like we were just moving along and trying to train for endurance and speed. And it has some consequences to all of that, which I think we're going to get to, Brian, but about, like, I know we all feel really great about the summer classes that we have. We're looking back on the ones who got away, and we're looking back on the ones who just weren't able to showcase their best, and we couldn't get them over the finish line. Whereas in another type of recruiting cycle, we probably could have, if there had just been more time. So from our perspective, it's just, I think everybody's feeling an intense amount of pressure, an intense amount to be first, to be visible, and then I'll stop talking, but that Reddit and those rumors, and if there are partners on the call, I say this with all due respect, but it is rumors going on from partner to partner about what they think is happening at another firm, and going to their recruiters and say, you're not doing X. And so somewhere in the middle lies the truth, but on either side, there's also a little bit of embellishment, and it makes you feel like you're just never doing enough.
I can jump in before we.
Yeah.
So on the last point, I understand and agree everything Nancy said, and I've heard lots of it. And yes, it's the partner gossip or whatever they hear from their friends at other firms is rarely correct, because it gets back to us, and then we no, that's actually didn't happen. So feel free to call the schools. We'll know if it's happening. Yeah, I was in Washington, New York, and visited a bunch of firms last week. And yeah, almost universally what Nancy was talking about, the love of people bit, I could see people they were doing a great job, but that was clearly just like Nancy described. So, I'll say one other thing. And by the way, when we ask students, they have some conflicting things as well. What else would you like to tell firms? Well, being on campus and meeting students is really valuable. So it is valuable. And the pressure that at the same time, the firms want to be there, but just the right. So how do they draw the right amount? I mean, who knows what that is? And then one other point I'll make is, this is a first world problem, but multiply it by 100 for a lot of schools in the big cities or like us, and students are overwhelmed and don't know where to go for which programs and that kind of thing. So even though the individual, so it's extremely, we totally see the challenge that Nancy and her colleagues at the firms are under, and don't have a great answer for that at the moment either.
It's interesting to hear how big a role Reddit seems to be playing as kind of like an informal chat, where both lawyers and students are kind of going to get information. Nancy, follow-up question for you. On the recruitment side for the firms, I think something that I know my firm always thinks about is fit. Is this person a good fit at Errant Fox? We nickname it the Foxy Sparkle. Do they have a Foxy Sparkle? That's trademarked if there are any Fox Rothschild people on here. You're not allowed to take that. But for us, that really matters. And I think I'm sure for you at Fried Frank, you're looking at people and seeing like not just are they smart and capable, do they go to, do they have high grades, but you're also looking for fit. Would they work at Fried Frank? And, to the points that Carey and Bruce were making earlier, if someone doesn't even know what Big Law is and they're bombarded in October, November of their first year with firms, have you found in the past few years that you have struggled more to find people who actually, can identify where you can identify whether they are or are not a fit, because that mentality hasn't been fully formed around their professional identity? I'm just curious how you think about that aspect of recruiting.
It's a really valid question. And I think in the speed and construct of which we are doing it, you hope you are getting the fit correct in those meetings that you are having with people. Where I think the worry for me personally comes in, and where I try to address it, which almost seems, some people may hear this and think that is way too late, but is the summer associate program. And it's after people accept. And so we try to split the recruiting team's time, which I'm not alone in this. Everybody has very lean teams. Not all of us have the ability to have folks that focus just on recruiting and those on summer program. But what we try to do is spend time making people feel okay with their decision, and using that next year to build relationships with them so that by the time they come in May, and they're with us throughout the summer, we're addressing the elephant in the room, that this was done in such a way that was really chaotic or felt really chaotic. I think we're all professional though in how we go about doing this, that you're trying to make sure people understand the firm. You're giving them the opportunity to express any concerns or things that have come out that maybe they didn't feel comfortable asking at that time, or they didn't even know what they didn't know until they're starting to arrive at your door. And we've been lucky. I will say we've been lucky at Fried Frank that I think that 25th hour of the day has worked in our favor of trying to cultivate a relationship. But there's always a handful that are going to say, like when they come here, this is not for me. Either it's Big Law is not for me, or this firm is not for me. And they're going to try it again in 3L hiring, or they're going to try to network with people if they've heard a friend has had a more positive experience. But I don't think any of us are losing sight of fit. It's just where are you able to do that? And so I think another complicated layer to this is that a lot of us were trying to push for in-person interviewing and trying to be flexible, offering that hybrid choice. But we were one of the places that wanted to see a candidate in person to try to mitigate any of that, of having the candidate determine if we were a good fit and feel the exchange of energy. But that's not entirely possible all the time. And so I think what we're going to see is that fit is going to play a huge factor at the end of the 2025 summer programs, because this was really, really wild. If students feel like they had a bird in the hand and they grabbed it, but maybe it wasn't the best bird for them at the time.
Yeah, I mean, everything that Nancy's efforts to try to work on the fit are terrific. And I know probably all firms work on that. And it's definitely a bigger challenge given the time frame. I mean, one thing that the students are well aware that I've seen, talked with, and heard from others, right? They put it as, we do not have time to make informed decisions, which goes to fit. A lot of it also is the timing and disparate schedule. There wasn't a single starting point. And then with 2 weeks of, or whatever the time frame is, right, you have to accept an offer. So what we've distilled it from, my phrase is, many students accepted offers out of convenience over conviction, which is not good for certainly the employers, and the students slash future attorneys as well. But that's a lot of what I've heard and seen here and from others around the country.
Sounds like it's going to be very interesting to watch over the next couple of years to see whether those folks have a stickiness to them, so to speak, or whether they're going to be sort of looking for the door if it really was not the right fit and they didn't have that conviction going into it. So Lillian, I'm going to turn to you. Of course, we know that big law is not the only part of the profession that's been affected by these shifting timelines in OCI in recent years. So wonder if you can share your experience from the public sector, to very large and important government agencies where you've led recruitment efforts. What's your perspective on this?
Sure, Brian. Hi. So I'm about to express my own personal views, and not the views of the Department of Justice. Need to put out that disclaimer first. I started this summer at the New York City Law Department, which takes about 50 summer interns each summer, about half are 1Ls, about half are 2Ls. And I ended my summer at the U.S. Attorney's Office, SDNY, and we have almost exclusively 1Ls. We had maybe two 2Ls, but we have 60 summer interns and 58 of them were 1Ls, and they were all interviewing with the big law firms, because that's the pattern. They come to us for their 1L summer, and then they go off to a big firm for their 2L summer, and then they come back to us later is generally what happens as lateral candidates later. So I had two very different views into this process. So at the law department, the 1Ls were definitely interested in OCI, but it wasn't as much of a focus. They were more focused on government or public interest as a career path. And so there were more of them that were opting out of the law firm process. And so I didn't feel the impacts really of OCI or the changes to law student recruiting until I moved over to the U.S. Attorney's Office and was talking to the 61Ls here. And it was dramatic. Okay, so there were students handled it in a range of ways. And my predecessor, before I started at the U.S. Attorney's Office, had actually sent a letter out to the summer interns before the summer started. Neil Corwin wrote this letter, and I thought it was excellent. And I would encourage, if any public interest, public sector employers are on this call, I would encourage you to send out a similar letter, because students are wondering, and they don't know how to bring this up, right? This is a really hard thing for them to say, hey, I am about to be interviewing for my next summer job. I know I'm with you this summer, but I need to interview for my next summer job, where a law firm is going to pay me a lot of money to come, and it's going to set my career, right? And so so understandably, they want to focus on doing those interviews and handling them well. But they do need to kind of know what their 1L summer employers' expectations are around this so that they can meet them, right? And so he talked about how, yes, we understand that you're managing this, and it is so hard. I can't even imagine being a law student right now trying to manage both doing your first internship, maybe your first internship ever, because you've gone straight through from college to law school, and also trying to interview for a job that you view as setting you on your path for your whole career, right? So I get how difficult it is, but they also need to recognize that they are setting their reputations with their 1L employers too, right? And that's really hard as well. I mean, they want to do well there. So they're being pulled in two very different directions. I hope that the public interest, public sector employers out there, as well as others who may take 1L summer interns, that they'll be understanding of this. My what I've heard is that they're not all understanding, but I hope that they will be, because this is a tough thing for the students. And so they need to, you know, they'll want to have places to interview. They'll want to have time off for interviewing. And that will be awkward conversations with them. We told them, communicate with us, you know, share with us what you need. We'll try to help you as best we can. You know, please get your work done, right? Because you still need to get your assignments done. The interns diverged in how well they were able to manage this, right? Some had a really tough time, did not communicate well, did not finish their work. And so now they have that reputation with the people who supervise them, right? Others managed it very well. They communicated, and I would say the vast majority actually managed it really well. And they communicated to their supervisors when they were going to be out. They still got their work done, which was really hard for them because, you know, they're out of pocket for hours and then that can turn into more hours. And so I've heard from some that they stayed up late to turn in an assignment that they had promised, right? But they were able to do that. But even those students reached out to me when I posted on LinkedIn that I was doing this event to say, hey, I managed this. Yes, I did, but it was terrible for me. It caused me to miss out on, you know, very interesting trials that were happening, meetings with judges. And so even those who handle it well are having a tough time. So it's really doing, I think, the students a disservice. It's not allowing them to get that real 1L summer experience. It's contributing to the public interest creep. So at the NALP Annual Education Conference last summer, there was a great panel that talked about how students are kind of getting pulled away. You know, they come into law school thinking they want to do public interest, but because of, you know, the groupthink that's around going to a big firm, the salary differential is quite dramatic in some instances, most instances. They're getting pulled into the private sector. And I think that's happening even more because they don't have the time to figure out what they want to do. They haven't even had their, you know, I was talking to somebody who works on the law firm side, and she was saying to me that, you know, in interviews, the candidates don't have anything to talk about because they haven't really been at their internship yet and haven't done anything. So it's definitely having an impact both on the students in their 1L internships, those who are trying to manage the 1L internship process on the public interest public sector. And I think it's going to become more problematic as time goes on. I have talked to one employer, public interest employer, who's not taking 1L summer interns anymore because they don't want to have to manage this, because it's not a small thing, right, to manage. And I've heard of others taking less 1L summer interns, which is too bad because, again, we want students to go into public interest, public sector. So it's tough on the public interest, public sector side as well.
Follow-up question on that, and thank you for that overview. I'm curious, based on that, I mean, it sounds, if I was a manager in public sector, public service work, this sounds like a total nightmare because I have an intern and she emails me constantly and she says, oh, I have to go to Paul Weiss this week. I'm so sorry. Oh, I have to go to Millbank this week. I'm so sorry. And it's like, then my calendar is, you know, I'm trying to track where all these like, it sounds complicated to say the least. So I'm wondering from your perspective, Lillian, do you see that chaos and that sort of unpleasantness could lead to more tailored or more limited, I should say, opportunities for 1Ls in public service, where maybe government agencies will say, we're not interested in being a stepping stone or a training ground for big law. We only want you if you demonstrate commitment that you actually want to be in public service for the long run. Because I could imagine, just based on what you said, that could be a risk, but I'm curious what you think.
So honestly, my impression is that that there are employers who are pulling out of doing 1L summers on the government side because of the logistical headache, not because of no, only come to us if you want to be in government forever. Because in talking to government recruiters, there's an understanding that there may be some back and forth between government and law firms. So it isn't so mission driven of a statement, it's more logistical. But I have heard from the public, the legal services organizations, a different thing, right? Which is, no, we need people who are committed to our mission here. And so I've heard of employers asking questions on the legal services side. You know, do you intend to interview with law firms this summer for next summer? You know, asking those kinds of questions to, I think, see how real in their mind the commitment to the mission is. I don't agree with that, but I think that that's the reason. And so I do foresee a world where there will be, you know, public interest employers who are only interested in people who can vehemently say, I am wholeheartedly committed to this mission, and not picking up the students who are interested and they're exploring, and maybe this is their calling, but they don't know, they haven't been there yet. And so I think that's a missed opportunity, because I can't remember if it was maybe Carey who was talking about, or maybe it was Nancy, somebody was talking about how, you know, there are people who will, it was Nancy, who will decide after being at a firm for a summer, this isn't the right place for me. And if they have had the 1L experience at a government agency or public interest, then they have something to compare it to. The thing that really worries me, that I think is happening more and more, and I don't know if Carey or Nancy or Bruce or Nakaya want to talk about this, but it's the 1Ls, the 1L students who are getting recruited by firms to go to 1L for their 1L summer at a firm, 2L summer at the firm, and then may have a realization their 2L year, I didn't really like my summer experiences, but I was doing this because I need to make money for my family. And then they don't have a comparison. They don't have another employer that they have worked for to go back to as another option. So that kind of scares me.
Thank you for that. That's definitely another educational concern, I think. So now we'll turn to the fun part of the panel, which is some brainstorming. We've just heard there is a lot of unhappiness on the student side, a lot of chaos on the student side, and also a lot of unhappiness and chaos on the employer side, both public and private. So now the question is, what do we do? What, if anything, can we do to mitigate or address some of these real concerns that our panelists have laid out? So the panel has brainstormed just a few, I'll call them concepts of a plan, which is a very popular phrase these days. And I want to talk through those, but I'm also interested in what our attendees have to say and any questions on your mind. So please start to populate the Q&A function as well, and we will bleed in some Q&A to this. But first, I'd like to turn to a few of the ideas that we've discussed internally, one of which Lillian just referenced, which is 1L summers and how we're thinking about 1L summers for Big Law as a recruitment vehicle. My understanding is that traditionally 1L summer programs were fairly limited within Big Law. They were often diversity focused, or they were focused in certain demographics, or fairly narrow as a percentage of overall OCI. And my sense anecdotally is that is changing in response to some of these trends that we're seeing. But maybe we could first turn to Carey, who I know has, and Bruce on the law school side, and then Nancy, maybe you could add on the firm side.
Absolutely. I think, you know, for us, application for 1L summer, while certainly some firms are increasing the size of their 1L class, it is still so small in proportion to the 2L class. And I think that sort of the 1L application period can be just a little bit of a preview for 2L. So I don't think it's a bad idea for 1L students to be applying to big law firms, but I think that often the benefit is more about 2L recruitment than it is necessarily about 1L recruitment. So, you know, for me on that, I think one of the things that would help this is just a lot of transparency and intentionality about what gets posted on a website, on a portal, and when. So I think one of the things I heard Bruce talk about it, we've certainly had this experience. If, you know, if a firm posts, let's say, a 1L position in the middle of our fall finals. No matter what we say in the OCS office, there is this like, oh, you got to get an application and you got to get an application in. But if that law firm isn't going to look at people until their applications are complete, i.e. the transcript is in, or they're not going to start interviewing until mid-January or late January, provide that transparency, because that transparency from firm directly to student is what I think will start to make a difference to sort of calm some of this, like the rushing and the speed. And nobody wants a student to put in an application because they feel like they have to be the first one at the starting line. You want good, considered applications all around. So for me, across the board, I think that is something everybody can do as an institution. Make decisions about when we're going to interview, what we need to see to interview, and let's make sure that the students know that.
I would and I would extend that through the summer as well. Many students that I've seen comments from and data, and it's about that, right? Our advice to firms, right? Can you let us know? I wish the firms would let us know, right, if I'm on the wait list or how much time to expect. And I know historically firms are reluctant because they think telling students certain things will make the student feel like, she's on the B list. And that's not a good, in this world, I don't think it'd be great if you did not worry about that. Students just want to know, where they are, where they stand, what's next, what's the process, right? What to expect, when to expect it. Just like Carey said, that goes throughout, right? Screening, callback, when to expect to hear something. And if you don't hear something, right, after, just like you hope students will contact you to let you know they're still interested, instead of 3 weeks of silence, let them know that they're still interested, because they don't know how to interpret that. And we'll tell them typically no news is not bad news. It means you're still under consideration. But it'd be great, again, to hear directly from the employer, as Carey said. That would go a long, long way to helping certainly on the student mental health front, if nothing else.
So that sounds like one really good concrete idea, which is when firms open up job posts, to be really clear about timeline. That's what I'm hearing from both of you. Timeline for consideration, timeline for, are they waiting for grades or not in the fall and spring? Other ideas from the panel about what do we do from here?
I would just jump on and encourage, which I think many of us do, but clear lines of communication between recruiters and career services. I know that I've had many conversations with colleagues at schools to say have this many people out there, or we have the following students out there, or we haven't heard from the student. So the ghosting goes both ways. And so it would be helpful if, we had a clear idea of where we stood with a candidate and knew how much attention should we be putting on somebody, or are we missing a diamond? Are we missing somebody entirely? And, schools they're fair, they're equal to all of their employers, but, everybody wants people to be matched and matched well. And so while not making suggestions about who you should hire, they can delicately guide you towards students, or encourage behind the scenes a student to have transparent conversations with the employer. But I think we're all hearing transparency it's an emergency. It's like the hot button thing that if we're walking away, just being clear about our timelines. And there are some firms out there that do a really, really good job at laying down the rules of the road. And so for those of us who maybe aren't so clear, it could be reaching out to people who are doing that well and getting some guidance from them, because there are jobs for everybody. If we are going after the people that are the right fit for our firms, that can't be the same candidate for every single one of us. But just being clear about the opportunity and the timeline, and just having those conversations with the Careys and the Bruces of the world are huge.
Yeah, agreed. I would please call us. Every student, yeah, we all like to know when people are ghosting you. I mean, I'll tell you, and then one other to Brian's question, right? What can be done? I would say, you know, to employers, like, revisit things that have worked in the past, and nothing has a perfect solution. We have analyzed this from I'm sure all the schools and employers here have, from every which way. Every decision has downsides or it doesn't change things. I would say there's huge virtues to OCI or virtual OCI. I understand why employers may like the way it is now, but everything we've talked about, some of it actually can be solved by an OCI program. Many of you may know we moved ours to May 19th this year. We don't know what the results will be, but there's a lot of positives we hope it will lead to for a lot of the issues we've addressed. We know it doesn't address a lot of the issues talked about today, but among other things, we hope it'll really help with the spring pressure on 1Ls and not feel like they have to, be interviewing as much or during spring finals, because we hope the firms will know that, I think as Nikaya said initially, that just in May, there will be that market where everybody will be available. So, right, be open to those things, I would encourage. And I know a lot of other schools are thinking about different ways to get at this, perhaps with similar approaches,
Yeah, I would merge what Nancy and Bruce are saying, which is, talk to your law school partners, because truly, although most of our big law recruiting is now outside of the OCI process, we still had a nice OCI last summer. And folks got some really extraordinary candidates. And I think if we can just move away from this scarcity mindset that everybody's going to be gone, it's not true. There are tremendous opportunities to recruit. And maybe for your firm, that is later in the summer, or you want to do it in a different way. I think there are opportunities to do things that are much more about quality and connection and less about sort of a temporal timeline. Let's do it immediately and let's have it be done. I think that creates more equity, and really, truly, there are amazing, amazing candidates.
Carey, something else that you talked about in our prep call was, firms paying attention to how they're recruiting and the impression that they're giving to the students just by how they're recruiting. And that really resonated with me. I talked to one of our current fall externs just about how her fall externship was going. And she shared with me that a firm that she had been a paralegal before law school, big firm. And right before, I think it was, I can't remember if it was like the deadline to register for OCI or what it was, her firm that she was paralegal at reached out to her and gave her an exploding offer and said, if you come back to us, no interviews, right? Because she had been a paralegal there. They, I guess, figured that she would be a fine summer associate. If you accept before, end of the day tomorrow, which was like OCI registration, you will have a summer associate position. If you don't, she asked for a little more time. She went back. Good for her, right? To ask. Students, I think, are, and maybe some firms just aren't flexible about it, but I've heard, some students pushing back, which more power to them, right? Asking for different interview times, trying to manage their summer internships that way. But she asked for more time on this offer. The firm said no, right? Again, she had the impression that they were pushing her, and now they really pushed her, right? And she decided, that's not where I want to go. I'm going to not take the bird in the hand, even though it's in the hand, because I don't want to work at a place that's going to treat me that way. And I hope that students start looking at it that way. I think that they are. I think that because they may be in financial circumstances or just out of fear because other people are getting offers, they're maybe not fully listening to this gut reaction that they're having to firms, but they're forming them, right? They clearly are forming them. And Carey, I don't know if you want to share any more, because it was a really great point in prep.
Yeah, so if I were starting a law firm tomorrow, first of all, I would hire Nancy Parker if she would have me as my director of recruiting, because she's absolutely amazing. But one of the things that I would love to see happen more is, you know, I think it is very difficult from the firm side to separate yourself from all the other firms and articulate who you are and attract law students. And I would make how we recruit a part of defining who we are as a law firm. So if we want to talk about inclusivity, if we want to talk about a focus on mental health, if we want to talk about academic achievement, I would design my recruitment model around those things and let students know, hey, we are not going to look at anything until we have all of your 1L grades because that's important to us. That's a value. Maybe we even wait a couple weeks so that we have parity with all the schools so we can look at everybody at the same time. That's something I've seen too, because that equity and that inclusivity are important. And I think linking the behavior as a recruiter and the firm culture can be a way both to maybe center more on the student experience, but also can define a firm's interest in the student experience.
Students are aware, they know about that and do make decisions based on what Carey just said.
That's a
And
really
your term, the
interesting.
scarcity mindset, yeah, that's a great term. I'm taking that, I'm borrowing that now. Incorporate that into my repertoire. That's exactly what's from both sides. Again, students, schools, and employers. So how can we change incentives to reduce that is really what we're all thinking.
Brian, there's some good stuff sort of heating up in the Q&As.
Yeah.
That people are reacting to either things that we've said and wanting some clarity on it, or going back to a suggestion I think that came at the beginning of the panel about the medical matching system. And Nakaya, I think you said you would maybe jump in there.
Yeah, let me address that one because that always comes up in this conversation. So I think there's probably a lot of people with a question about how did that happen? Why is that allowed? And can we in the legal industry get the same sort of exemption? So just for background on that, the medical match program has actually been subject to antitrust litigation. In 2002, a bunch of medical school graduates themselves brought a class action lawsuit against the schools and hospitals, alleging that program, their participation in the program violated antitrust law because it suppressed wages as well as had other anti-competitive effects. And that case actually survived a motion to dismiss. The court ruled that if the students could, or the graduates could prove their allegations, it would be an antitrust violation, right? But then the schools and the hospitals got together and they went and lobbied Congress. And they convinced two senators, one from New Hampshire and one from Massachusetts, to tack a rider onto another bill that had nothing to do with education or antitrust or anything like that. It was a bill about pensions. And they got it tacked onto that. And so when the bill passed, that exemption was passed and it was never even argued on the floor. That exemption, I think someone actually posted it in the notes here, is very, very limited. It specifically says something akin to evidence of the medical match program cannot be used to establish an antitrust violation, right? So it's limited to what happened in the schools or in that medical school context. It does not apply to the legal industry or anything else. Now, in terms of the question was, can we go and get such an exemption ourselves? And I think it's always possible. I think it would be difficult though, because the political climate around antitrust enforcement has changed since 2002. So starting in 2017 with the Trump administration, the FTC's and DOJ's interpretation and enforcement of antitrust laws dramatically changed and became much, much more aggressive in pursuing perceived violations. And in particular, they targeted education, employment, and trade associations, right? The exact space we're all operating in. And that's continued under the Biden administration. In fact, the Biden administration has gone even further and made it a signature issue of their platform. So regardless of who wins the next election, I've been told by experts in the antitrust field that they do expect there to be this continued heightened enforcement of antitrust regulations. And so that means that the support of this aggressive stance on antitrust is actually bipartisan. So I think it would be much more difficult to convince Congress now than it was back in 2002 to convince Congress to do some sort of exemption. Additionally, the public interest arguments here are a little different when we're talking about training doctors to make sure that they have the correct training not to harm people, right, in their field, versus students who are going into a certain segment of practice, right, private practice and specifically. So I think the arguments here are a little different. I think the political climate has changed, but that's not to say it's not possible. I just think it would be a little bit more challenging today.
just to follow up on that, and that's such an interesting point about the effect of antitrust and how that constricts us. Would your analysis be any different if instead of it being an sort of independent entity like NALP that was the coordinator, so to speak, it was something like the ABA? We have a question in the chat about whether the ABA, which of course has a formal role in regulation of law schools and accreditation, whether the ABA could be a sidestep in some way. For example, just throwing this out there, could the ABA section on legal education post something on its website that says, here's our recommended recruitment timeline, and just throw it out there, and then firms could follow it, schools could follow it, but it would become an industry norm, so to speak, that recruitment doesn't start until XYZ time. I'm just curious, what's your reaction to that?
Yeah, I think it's challenging for the ABA, and I don't want to speak for my esteemed colleagues over there, but you have to remember the ABA has actually been subject to antitrust litigation as well over their accreditation processes, right? In 1995, there was a big suit that was brought against the ABA around some of their accreditation policies that they had. The consent decree that settled that case is why we now have the ABA Council, and it acts separately from the ABA, right? So they can do things, but they're still subject to antitrust law as well. And so what they do has to be pro-competitive, not anti-competitive. So I think they have challenges as well. But I will say, you know, again, I don't want to speak for them, but I will say they're aware of this issue. I speak to them quite frequently. I speak at their meetings, and they're very much aware of what a problem this is and considering it themselves.
Before we move on from antitrust, I know we don't have any antitrust lawyers on this panel. Maybe we need to have a subsequent follow-up on it. Any reactions or additional thoughts on the impact of antitrust on this set of issues? Okay. Yeah, it does. It's an interesting element that I think is a really challenging workaround, because when I explain this situation to sort of a neutral third person, their first instinct is, why don't you all just coordinate? And well, unfortunately. So I'm going to turn to just a couple other questions from the chat. So we have a question about diversity, a few questions about diversity, and whether maybe this is mostly for Nancy and maybe Lillian. Have you seen this accelerated timeline negatively impact in any way diversity, first gen, stats like that? Because we've been sort of referring to this dynamic where suddenly you're asking law students who may have no conception of what the big law universe looks like, having to make these decisions really quickly. So I'm curious whether you've seen that borne out in statistics. And Nikaya, you might also have a sense of what that looks like on a more macro level. Nancy, do you want to kick it off?
I think, you know, statistics are sort of out the window at the moment, because what we were able to sort of gauge against the previous year, everything is sort of turned on its head. There is definitely a heavy weight and a heavy concern put on diverse populations, first gen, to ensure that they are feeling prepared, feeling like that they have the opportunities that their other colleagues have. And so I think there is a real pressure that adds to this bit of like a pressure cooker that we're in, to make sure that firms are taking the time to engage with those student groups, leveraging if you have employee resource groups at your firms, leveraging them and encouraging them to be sort of an informal mentor, or if there's a structured mentor program in place with their school, to get involved in that way. It feels like a giant mess, if I'm being completely honest, in the sense of we're going after diverse candidates on so many levels that I can only imagine how that population is feeling, of just the pressures being pulled in a million different directions, and to choose at the end of the day what's the right fit for them. But I think to combat that is to have a strong partnership with your diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging teams at your firm. And I know that's something that my firm is focused on, and we sort of survived this last season, but we're going to use some time to go through what worked, what didn't work, blind spots, and create a real partnership about how to get in front of this for the next cycle and cycles moving forward. But I have no doubt that there are, as I said a little while ago, that there are many, many wonderful students who just didn't know what was happening or got caught up in sort of the tornado or the hurricane of this pre-recruitment and all of this craziness that it is a real worry. And I think it's only going to get worse if we don't figure out strategies on how to partner with these groups and make sure that we're giving them fair and equitable access. I don't know if I answered that correctly because it's a mess, Brian. The short answer is it's a mess.
So I'll add some color to what Nancy said. We absolutely see disparities in the employment outcomes already for graduates of color as well as first-gen graduates. We see significant employment disparities with those two populations. And for anybody interested in that, I'll just put a plug in that NALP is doing their annual disparities webinar this Wednesday. So definitely watch out for that because we'll talk about the employment disparities for the class of 2023. So we don't have data yet on the class of 2024. We won't begin collecting that data until this spring. And they're going to be the first class that was really subject to pre-recruiting during the recruiting process, right? Because they went through the recruiting process in 2022. But even the class of 2023, which benefited from the talent wars, where there was like all this vigorous recruiting and then everybody got a job, right? It was really, really high employment rates for that class. We saw, again, significant disparities for graduates of color in particular and first-gen graduates. Both of those groups struggle a bit more in this population. And again, there's overlap. A lot of those first-gen individuals are graduates of color, right? So there's a lot of overlap between those two groups. But that aspect of having somebody who can guide you through this process, who's been through it before, really provides an advantage for students. So we really see it there as in particular. And we see those disparities both in terms of overall employment rate and bar passage required jobs. So do they become a practicing attorney, and employment rate specifically going into private practice.
Is that the disparity different in the 23 than it was in the class of 19 or 18?
It actually grew a little bit this year for Black, Native American, and Native Hawaiian graduates. We did see a little bit of growth there in those disparities, but we're going to talk more about that on Wednesday.
No spoilers.
Yeah.
Just one more beat on this issue. I'm wondering, either from the firm perspective or from the recruitment side, is there anything that can be done tactically, practically to kind of address that issue? Nancy's point, I mean, it sounds like if you're, I'm not sure, Nancy, how firms actually get data on who self-identifies as being diverse. Do you feel that recruiters have all of the information that they need to target those people, or is it that you're hunting around on sort of student organization websites to try to, I don't know, what's your approach for how you get at those populations to spread the word about recruitment?
You know, I think you said something that's really key is in this environment, we don't have all of the data on so many different things. So you're relying on partnerships with student groups. You're relying on a student stepping forward and maybe self-identifying. But to, go rewind to when we started this, some students are just not comfortable to even do that. This is such a very stressful and not to sound over dramatic, but a frightening environment that they don't know what that information is being used for or what the intention is. So it's a little bit of putting clues together, but we shouldn't be relying on students to identify in some manner. We should be proactive in the way we are approaching this process and making it a transparent process for everybody, which yet again, I know puts a tremendous amount of pressure on the recruiters and the firms, but we are the ones with the jobs. And so we do owe a sense of a bit of a roadmap and not forcing somebody to have to hunt and find information on the student side, but to just be proactive with your recruitment strategy of how you are going to address this in an overarching way.
I mean, we're fortunate, right? I'm sure most schools, the student groups, affinity groups, 2Ls and 3Ls are very active even before without employers, just sharing their experiences with the first years. And that's a big piece of what can be done in the spring. I mean, in the fall, the first month of school. Yeah. But
So it
again,
sounds like the diversity recruitment element is another area where these problems are potentially accentuated. Bruce, a few questions for you are popping up in the chat about Duke's plan regarding OCI in the spring. So we have a few questions that are sort of asking you for a bit more about the logistics. So for example, does that create pressure for students who are, because OCI, of course, used to be like an August thing, and it sounds like you're moving it to May. Does that create pressure around grades and studying for finals? And does your office supplement grades over the summer? How do those sort of logistics work?
well, yeah, those are all the right questions. I was going to answer another question somebody asked as well related to that about grades and all that, the timing. So someone said, well, one of the questions was, oh yeah, here it is. Classmates got, I know I can't even find the right question, but the first semester grades, most firms that we've been speaking with still want to see full year grades. And most offers, yes, there was 2L recruiting in January, February, March, April, explicitly for 2L year, even before students had their 1L jobs. That again, most of those, at least our experience, were not accepted by the students, a couple maybe. So it wasn't overall a valuable endeavor. And most firms still want to see, at least tell us they want to see a full year of grades. So yeah, no, our program is grades are expected within a week to 10 days after that. So first day or two of June, we know that's an issue. People would like to have it before, but then if we wait longer, then it opens up the incentive. Again, the scarcity mentality will take over in spring semester, and then there will be interviewing and all of that rushing for, we expect. So students will not be applying during finals. We expect they will have their bids in and they won't have to do anything during finals. And we thought about moving, starting in mid-June, but that's when 1Ls are working. So that exacerbates that problem even further. So again, there's no perfect solution. And I'm certainly not saying ours is the best. It's definitely not the only, and we don't even know it's a solution, but we felt we had to try something different. Our OCI, to Nikaya's earlier statistic about how many got jobs through OCI, let's put it this way. Ours was so few students interviewed during our OCI at the end of July and August that it did not make sense to do it again. And that's
Because they already had jobs?
They already had jobs, right. So then we said, what are the virtues of the OCI program? And again, it's structure, it's a single starting point. If we can put it at the right time and it reduces the spring scarcity mentality, maybe reduces the 2L recruiting activity in the spring semester, like interviews, literal interviews, because those jobs will be coming up. So again, we don't know how that'll play out, but that's our hope and expectation, or that's our hope at least, and our thought process.
We have a question from a 1L student who's in the room, which is basically, sorry, basically, what should I do? Sorry, I'm getting over a cold. So if you're a 1L listening to all of this, how should you approach your 1L year? It's now mid-October. Strategically, should you be listening to Carey and Bruce and studying for torts, or should you actually maybe be listening to some subtext here and
here's the thing as well.
Emailing Nancy on the side? What should you be doing?
Here's the thing as well, right? Everyone's situation is different. You can't give general advice. Some people who worked for 5 years before law school and have done this or that know exactly what they want to do. That's one set of advice. Somebody who doesn't have a sense of what they want to do, that's different. So the default is if you don't know, you better study. If you don't do well, you're not going to get the jobs you want. Knowing nothing about this student, that's the default advice. Focus on your classes for the next 2 months. You're not going to miss any jobs, or at least a meaningful number.
I also saw a really good comment in the chat that might also be helpful for the student, where somebody said, they saw academically stronger students because they did direct apply. And the key here is that they said they took their time and they didn't pressure students. So that is, we're out there, you know, and I agree, like focus on who you are, your grades, and then breathe, because there is a firm out there for you. There's more than one. And here's somebody writing in the chat that it was a great process for them, and that there wasn't this sense of pressure. I mean, it's a different time frame, but you know, pressuring students is not a great situation. And so I agree with Bruce of just like learn why you're there. And if you need to reach out, I had privately messaged the student to say, you know, happy to talk if we can help you breathe, because this is going to work out. It's just as Bruce said, it's figure out who you are. And then as my mother would say, there's a lid for every pot. So helping you figure out where you belong. But focus on, you know, just trying to wrap your head around being in school.
Exactly. And certainly right now, you're not going to miss many jobs.
Yeah, Carey talked about the noise, and you gotta tune out the noise, right? I mean, this will come up again and again in law school. You will be talking to your friends and somebody will have a job. You'll be talking to your friends and somebody found out that they made a certain journal, or that they got a certain internship, or that they're going to be clerking for a certain judge, or that they, you know, did this practice problem in bar prep and didn't get it right. Oh my God, the bar. There's a lot of noise in law school, and as unfortunate as it is that you have to like start practicing now, tuning that out, tuning into you, focusing on the experience. It's 3 years. It goes by really fast though. Enjoy it. Try to enjoy it. Try to focus on your studies. Figure out what classes you like the best, what teachers you like working with. Tune into you and figure out your path. You know, Nancy's talking about, you know, the lid for every pot. You will have your path. Everyone will have their path. And there's just too much groupthink in law school, in my impression, in my experience. And you've got to try and pull out of that and have that confidence in life that you will end up on the right path for you. And the first job that you get may not be where you necessarily want to end up, sure, but that won't be the only job you have in life, right? I have many friends who have moved in many different ways in their legal career, and it is really amazing to see the different paths that everyone is on now, when everyone started being like, oh my God, you know, these certain internships are the only internships to get. These certain judges are the only judges to clerk for, right? And then they go there all their different ways, and you will too, and it'll be good. Just try to not get all in your own head about it. It's hard. It's hard now.
Lily and Nancy, when you guys are ready to work for a law school, let me know. We can
Well, it sounds like
we
there's
can
a big-
arrange it, or at least I'll figure out how to make it work. You guys are amazing with your career counseling advice to students. So yeah.
It sounds like there's a very consistent message there, which is that if you're a 1L, this seems to be what both the career advisors and the recruiters are saying, is really focus on grades, focus on your studies, focus on yourself. And I would add that I'm on my firm's recruitment committee. I think from our perspective, it's like kind of crazy when we get a resume or something that has 1 semester of grades. It's not even, we put it in a pile that says, well, you know, what can we do with this at this juncture? We don't really know how to interpret it. So I think from all perspectives, the answer that I would give to a student is the same.
Brian, really
Yep.
fast.
Yeah.
So there definitely are the jobs where your grades matter and that's all that matters. Those aren't all the jobs that are out there in the world though, right? The experiences you have, the internships you have, the people that you work for and impress, that matters too. And so my advice is actually slightly different. Focus on the classes. Focus on your experience as a student. Enjoy it. Find the things that make you happy.
And to your point earlier about the connections, Lillian, maybe you could say just a few words about that, like the professional reputation that you need to develop even as a 1L and how that impacts your career.
Oh yeah, I mean, you are building, so they talk about networking, right? And that's going to, in your mind, going to cocktail parties and walking up awkwardly to people and introducing yourself and having a very odd conversation with a lot of different people. That's in my head. When I think of networking, that's what I think of. That isn't, in my experience, the best way to network. How you build your network is you work with people and you do good work with them. And that's your colleagues right now. So when you are in class, you are a good member of your classroom community. You are helping, sharing notes with the person that was out sick, right? When you're assigned to a group project, you're working on that well. When you make a journal, you are working diligently on your journal and turning things in when you say. You're doing a good job in your internship. You're being eager, turning in timely assignments, working hard. And that's how you actually build your reputation. And you will find after your first legal job, that's the thing that matters the most. Grades, no one cares about after your first job, or very rarely do they care about after your first job. It's your reputation. And you're setting that now with your colleagues and the work that you do.
Totally.
Nikaya, were you about to say something?
Yeah, just I echo everything Lillian just said, and just to like add a little bit more to it. I just got back from Cutting Signs, which is a fantastic program focused around career development for Native and Indigenous law students. And this came up there because this was a feeling that a lot of them had, and a lot of panic about that first job. And a lot of it comes around pressure of like this idea that that first job you're going to get is the job that defines your career for the rest of your life, right? And you're going to be in this job until you die. And that is just not true, right? We know from the data that right now, on average, law students are having 2.5 jobs in their first 3 years, right? We know that Gen Z is going to have, on average, 3 full career arcs, right? Not jobs, not 3 full jobs, but 3 full career arcs in their whole life, right? So it's really about focusing, I think, for the students on what experience they want for the next 3 to 5 years, right? And think about it in that term, and maybe that makes it a little bit more manageable for the student who is on this session and for other students.
Thank you for that. We have a few questions in the chat that all relate to kind of the level of communication between career services offices and recruiters. And it's interesting, the questions kind of come in different directions, but we have one that sort of says, are firms intentionally sneaking behind the career services office to go after students without really sharing information? And then on the other hand, we have sort of a couple questions that are asking whether career service offices are getting all of the necessary information, for example, about a firm's class size or about deadlines and expectations. So maybe Nancy, Bruce, Carey, could you speak about kind of like, do you guys talk to each other? Do you feel like you have enough information as between advisors and recruiters, or is there some better way that information could be shared?
I know many of my colleagues are frustrated that they feel like maybe law schools are getting sort of cut out of the process. I will tell you that I don't share that view. I think, if there has been something that I have enjoyed about the accelerated recruiting, it is the opportunity to continue to sort of develop relationships with our law firm partners and be in conversation. And I find that when I can sit down one-on-one with law firms and we talk about our academic calendar and how we run our recruiting, which is different than how Bruce runs his recruiting, we can find a lot of common ground and work really, really beautifully together. So I don't think there is, and Nancy can pipe up, but I know what she's going to say. Like, nobody's trying to sort of make an end run around law schools. And I think those relationships are still so vital. I think maybe the frustration is a transparency piece. And I think last year that might have just been that everybody was feeling their way through and feeling this panic and feeling like they have to be sort of the first one to post something. So I would just love to see, I think that may solve this feeling of law schools feeling cut out, is if everybody can see that, they understand the recruitings and the timelines for every sort of individual firm.
As I've said a lot, I agree with basically everything Carey said. Also, I mean, I know a lot of law firms, in schools have been adjusting in real time, which is also a challenge to, or easy to make one feel like, you know, you're not getting the full story, but like things are happening and changing. So there's that. Right. There is, someone said posting things on, I mean, there's so many places to post things, and quite frankly, we don't want to know about a lot of things, right? Do we need to be involved? So as talking to a lot of schools and our own experience, I mean, I think most firms try to provide as much information as they can to us. There's just, you know, every school now has a different thing, different policy, different plan, different systems, right? Like trying to keep on top of it all is hard. So, you know, I don't see any, like, I don't know, sneaky or whatever the terms were used were. It's just, it's a complicated world. And like the same thing, you know, we may forget to do things, and oh, how come we didn't do that? So everybody I know in the business tries to be that way. And again, it's so fast and complicated and changing real time that like it doesn't, you know, it just doesn't always happen as we might have wanted. But
Let me throw out one sort of tactical thing to make this maybe even more concrete. So my firm is going to post a 1L, you know, or sorry, a 2L. We're looking for summer associates job post, right? So should a firm like mine post that on our own website, which is what we would do normally, or should we like intentionally reach out to each career service office that, you know, potentially might send students our way and say, hey, can you post this on Simplicity or Flow Recruit or whatever, and get it out to students from all backgrounds or diverse backgrounds? I guess the question is sort of like the interaction between the employer and the school. Is it more fair if we just post it on our own website and do our own outreach, or is it more fair if we a firm just floods the market and says, okay, we want it on every school's job board and Simplicity?
both. It's easy to put on your own website, and it's easy to put it on Simplicity, and probably not every school, but pick however many you want and wherever you usually get people from.
And I'll make a plug, Brian, to put that information. If you're opening your portal, put the information in about when you're opening it, when you're actually reviewing deadline, you know, reviewing applications, all of that in the NALP directory of legal employers. That is a one-stop shop for students to find information about.
Students want to feel like they have equal opportunity to get the job. They can understand if they don't get it, but like, oh, how come you checked the website and I didn't? Like I checked the Simplicity, right? Like that creates the feeling of, you know, inequity. Even if maybe you want the first person because they took the initiative to check your website. I get that. But among the students, they want to feel like they had an equal opportunity to get it. Even if they apply and get rejected, that's easier to live with than feeling like it was unfair, the process.
We're coming to our last few questions here, and Nakai, I'm going to turn back to you because there are a few that relate to NALP. One question that's repeated in a couple different ways is whether NALP maintains essentially a database or a spreadsheet of like every big firm, and I assume like what openings they have, or what their hiring will look like for the coming year, what their application looks like. Is that something that NALP tracks, or are you even allowed to track it because it's competitive? What's your thought on that?
Well, it's publicly available information, right? Because the firms put it out there on their own websites when they open up their portals and everything. So we are allowed to track it, and we actually do in the NALP directory of legal employers, right? So a lot of this information that we're talking about can be put in that directory, and I strongly, strongly encourage firms to do that. We know, we've done the market research. We know that it is one of the prime tools that law students use when they are looking for law firms that they want to consider for employment. So put all of that information in the directory of legal employers. That will help tremendously. To the extent there's been some suggestions in the chat as to things we could do to improve the NDLE, or the NALP directory of legal employers, we are looking at that. And I'm making notes of all of the little suggestions that have come up today.
Terrific. I think that we have addressed the major topics in the chat. I'm just looking thematically here. But does Anyone else want to add any other ideas or any other reflections following today's conversation?
One thing that somebody that I was talking to, a friend was telling me from the law firm side, that that most law firms actually really liked the year that we did that they did the recruiting in January, that they felt like they got to see the most grades, number of grades, class selection. They got to take their time a little bit more. Nancy, is that true? Did you like the January? You personally, you don't speak for everybody, but you personally, did you like the January?
I did. I think there are pluses and minuses to all of this. We could also probably come back with difficulties that we faced during that. But yes, I think what the themes are, we're liking things that are efficient. We're liking more information. We're liking the ability to have time to make decisions. And January did feel a little bit like that afforded us the opportunity to do that. But then, of course, in this environment that we just went through, we felt like we maybe had a little bit more control over who we saw. So you're going to get people on sort of all sides of this thing.
Mm-hmm.
Other final thoughts or reflections?
Yeah, Brian, I just, one of the things that I've loved about this conversation is the focus on the student experience. And I think having had sort of a transitional year, moving away from OCI, I think we need to continue to be in conversation about that student experience and those moments, like when a student is not going to their legal writing class because they're going to a reception, or they're not clear on when they should be interacting with a portal and applying to something. I think if we keep that as our North Star, and start, really using these lessons that we learned and where the stress really starts and the tension really starts, I think that's a really good way forward.
Totally agree.
And I would just say partner together. Everybody operating in silos is not good. And so just sharing information, working towards this together, working through the pain points. There are some less obvious things you can do with schools. I know that Carey was great and gave us an opportunity. Penn, Georgetown, Duke, all of these schools, if you open up dialogue with them, every day of the calendar is occupied. But they may suggest something that's an alternative to a way to get access, and maybe partnering with other Office of Student Life or Office of Student Affairs. There are ways to create partnerships and channels with students that may not be so obvious to you. So just keep talking together.
Yeah, I agree with everything. Employers in particular, and students too, but we have to get past the scarcity mindset. There's a lot of great students out there, even beyond the ones that go to Duke, I know, but there's thousands, right? So just understand the consequences to the 1Ls, to your not students, to your future lawyers. Right? They need to have the critical thinking that is foundational to being a successful professional and lawyer, and everything else that goes with that, the professional development and the time to reflect. So there's plenty of good law students out there.
Great. Any other? Okay, well, we can wrap this up. I want to thank all of our panelists who are really, as I said, some of the most inspiring thought leaders who are so student-centric and so thoughtful about what all of this means more broadly for the profession. I should have said at the outset, this conversation is sponsored by the Council on the Profession at the City Bar, and that's chaired by, I see at least one of the chairs is here, Mary Lou Billick, and is also just a very thoughtful person on these issues. The great thing about the Council on the Profession is the whole goal of this committee is to tackle really thorny issues that don't exactly wrap up in a nice bow. I would love to end this panel with like, here's what we do, but we don't have that yet. We have a lot of concepts and a lot of ideas and a lot of problems. But if you have ideas, if you're an attendee, you have an idea that we haven't really thought about, please email me and I'll send it to Mary Lou, and I'll make sure that the council puts that on a future agenda for discussion and shares it with this group as well. Really thanks to all of you for coming. Thank you for your time these last couple hours. And I'm looking forward to working with all of you collaboratively to make this recruiting process as good and humane as possible for law students and employers. So thank you all so much.
Thank you, Brian.
Thanks,
Good
Brian.
job.
Take care, everyone.